Welcome back. Thank you for staying with us. As earlier publicized, let's get to our first interview of the night tonight. The Deputy Chief Observer of the European Union Elections Observation Mission Kenya is with us, Dr. Bieta Martin. Thank you for your time tonight on TV47. 21 days to Kenya's consequential 2022 contest. What are the observations in terms of the preparation so far of the Observer Mission?
Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be here. And I'm very happy to talk about the EU Election Observation Mission, which arrived at the end of June. So the expert core team has been here now for approximately 3 weeks. We arrived on the 27th of June, and it is a full-scale election observation mission with 48 long-term observers. They arrived last week and have now been deployed throughout the country to 39 of the 47 counties. And for Election Day, we're expecting another 48 short-term observers from Europe, plus a quantity from the diplomatic community. So altogether, we should be about 180 people by the time election day.
And what is the assessment as far as Kenya's preparation is concerned so far?
That's a very good question. So we're in the process of assessing. An election process is a long-term operation. Many of those stages are still before us. So we have met with many key stakeholders, with the IEBC, with a number of candidates, with members of the media, also with civil society organizations. And so we're building that picture right now about how the election process is going. And we will be making a preliminary statement some 2 days after the election day.
Often when you talk of observers and an election, people think as though you are coming to dictate to a certain country how to hold its own elections. That's not the case, isn't it? You are coming to observe, not dictate.
Absolutely. So we come completely independently, impartially, with no formally preconceived notions. And we operate according to a declaration of principles, which is now endorsed by some 55 organizations worldwide. And it really has impartiality, professionalism, and transparency at its core. And so we really come in a spirit of partnership, not to dictate, not to instruct, but really to learn from each other.
And how important is neutrality in that process?
Absolutely
that
crucial.
You remain neutral.
Absolutely crucial. We have no preconceptions as to one candidate or another candidate, no preconceptions as to one coalition or party, and we always come to look at the process and not at who may win or lose a race. The important thing is whether the democratic rules are being followed, and if so, the question of legitimacy lies with the Kenyan people.
But the question of legitimacy also lies on the reports observers give, isn't it? You shape the international opinion of how free or otherwise a country's election is or was.
Yes, but we really try to reflect what Kenyan citizens themselves see in the process and to give voice to the important stages of the process. There are many civil society organizations that will also be observing in Kenya. There are also many other international organizations like the African Union or the Commonwealth who will also be observing. And so really our reporting is to reflect the findings of those stakeholders and to properly reflect how that process is developing.
All right, the Observer Mission, I believe this will be the 5th time in Kenya since 2002. There was a report particularly of the 2017 election in which there was a nullified election, the first in Kenya's history. There was a spat between the mission and Kenya diplomatically. Kenya was not satisfied with the report the mission gave. Take us through that kindly.
Yeah, I'm not sure about the reaction of the Kenyan authorities to the report, but we did try to have a process whereby we would be able to release and follow up on that report in Kenya and to discuss that with stakeholders. Unfortunately, it was not possible to do in country at the time, but our reports are always public and in the public domain.
But Kenya protested the reason as to why the mission released its report in Brussels and the European Parliament, and not necessarily in Kenya?
I would say we always seek to publish those reports in the country whenever it's possible to have that process facilitated, and we very much hope that for these elections and for the future we can engage in that kind of process going forward in a way that will be constructive for all sides and that will be contributive to Kenyan democracy.
You say you're not dictating to a country like Kenya on how to hold its election, but often in the reports, and I was going through the 75-page report earlier on, you give recommendations of what countries should improve on.
That's right.
5 years since Kenya had its last general election, has Kenya, in your view, in the mission's view, worked on the recommendations of that report?
Yeah, I think the recommendations are particularly crucial. And they really are tied into the international principles and the international standards that countries such as Kenya have freely espoused. And in the same way that we observe in Kenya, we also observe in countries around the world, including in the European Union. So previously I was the head of elections for the OSCE, where we observed elections in my own country, Poland, in places like the United Kingdom, as far as afield as Canada. And we would make recommendations in each of those cases based on those standards, but really not with a desire to instruct, but really to show how international good practice could help countries move forward in the direction that they have decided to move. In Kenya, we're in the process, as we go through this election observation, to also evaluate the extent to which those recommendations have been moved forward, but also to look at ways that we can also try to work together to improve the process in the future, and that will form the basis for our recommendations in the coming report.
And should, as an observer, observe things that are not going as per the dictates of, for instance, how global best practice of elections are held? Let's assume for this scenario that there is evidence of rigging. As an observer, would you have to wait till the election is over to release that report, or what powers do you have to voice those concerns at that particular time?
Again, we're here to reflect those institutions and those actors who are in the process themselves. We're not here to investigate or to adjudicate from the point of view of our mission, but where there is credible evidence which is presented to authorities, which is investigated by bodies who are empowered to do that, or judicial decisions that move in a certain direction, we reflect those kinds of nuances in the reporting that we do, not only so that Kenyan society understands all of the different facets of an election process, but that also finds voice in the world community so that around the globe others know also how those processes are happening.
And how do you settle, for instance, the contradiction in 2017, where on one hand, the country's Supreme Court nullified an election, while many observers, the EU included, gave that election a clean bill of health?
Yeah, I think the report which we issued a few days after the elections was a very nuanced one, and it presented both positive elements of the elections as well as negative elements of the elections. That report is still in the public domain, and I think it's worthwhile to read in detail what it says. And so when we commented 2 days after the elections, we were commenting on the process up until that point, but there were still many stages which remain to be looked at, which were then reflected in our final report. And in the decision of the Supreme Court, that is the institution which is empowered to make such decisions. And so we stayed on in the country for 5 months to follow that process through to its legal conclusions, and then to give a full-bodied report at the end of that process, which I hope is reflective of the reality as it happened then.
Part of the highlights of that report were, one, the recommendation that action should be taken to strengthen the resilience of constitutionally independent institutions, IEBC's independence and accountability to be strengthened through greater financial autonomy, legal requirements to be made for a comprehensive result transmission framework. I was part of a panel that interviewed IEBC chairman last week on Wednesday.
Yes.
These are some of the things that the chairman was trying to address. In the missions, through the mission's eyes, has IEBC sorted what you cited then as a recommendation?
I think these recommendations are still in the process of being looked at and possibly addressed. We have met with the IEBC, the chairperson, and other members of the commission. Our long-term observers are also meeting at lower levels of the Commission. It's important not only that at the central level these principles are met, but that is also communicated downwards to the polling station level so that everyone is proceeding in these ways that should be determined for this process. And as we conduct our observation, we'll be getting additional information. I understand that the IEBC plans additional testing, that there is additional training to take place, that there will be more communication with the voters about the process. And so as those processes move forward, we will be constantly looking at, evaluating, and then later reporting on how that has developed in 2022.
Well, Kenya is strategically and geopolitically a very vibrant partner of the European Union. How important will a credible, free and fair election, peaceful to say the least, be in the EU's view?
Yeah, I think Kenya is a very important country, not only to the European Union, but also globally. It is a key example of democratic governance in the region, but also worldwide. And as part of that fabric of democratic countries who want to make progress, the success of these elections, the extent to which democracy is able to be furthered, will not only be an example for Kenya, but also an example for the region, and also in the world where many countries are facing challenges with democracy, not only in Europe, but in other parts of the world. And so I think it is a lesson that we can learn from each other, and hopefully these elections in Kenya will be such an election.
And given the institutions, some which the Observer Mission met, inclusive of the judiciary, I'm sure you'll meet IEBC. How confident are you these institutions will deliver a credible election?
That is a very good question, and I think many of those aspects will still come to light in the coming weeks. So we've just had initial discussions, we've had initial information provided to us, but there are still many stages of that process that remain to be seen. We will continue to observe those closely. We also have a number of experts for the first time on this mission in Kenya, a new voting technologies expert who has been deployed in recognition of new technologies becoming more on stream in different countries throughout the world. Also a social media analyst who will be examining the impact that the campaign in the social media has and how it influences or carries into the mainstream campaign and into mainstream media. So as well as looking at the electoral process and the work of the Commission, we'll also be looking very widely at different aspects, and especially newer aspects which may not have been present in the past.
You preempted a question I was going to ask, which is for the first time the mission has an election technology analyst.
Yes.
What informed this? Was it the 2017 meddling of the system?
I think it's more the impact that technologies have on elections worldwide. And if you look at other countries, we've deployed such new technology experts to places like Estonia, or to places like Norway, or to places like Switzerland that employ technology in their elections. And because Kenya is one of these countries that has technology as part of its electoral process, it's important to understand how that plays into the traditional process, what are the different parameters and transparency in the decision making that have taken place, and how that will impact the vote on election day.
Earlier on, we made reference to the 2017 report, of course released in 2018, which the Kenyan government, of course, reacted to. I beg I'm supposed to ask now, what is your relationship with the Kenyan government now?
I think we've received an open invitation from the Kenyan authorities. The meetings thus far have been very collegial and very welcoming and very friendly. And so we very much trust that the relationship will be built on this basis as we move forward. But as I mentioned at the start, we're really here in this spirit of partnership to try to work together to achieve common goals in order so that every country can achieve those aspirations which it has set itself.
The mission operates in accordance with the Declaration of the Principles of International Election Observers, which was endorsed, I believe, in 2005. Where does observers generally, not the EU now, generally draw the line between a country's sovereignty, the ability for a country to hold its free and fair or whatever perceived of an election, and interference?
I think sovereignty is always key, and no credible election observation organization would ever interfere in that sovereignty. And so it's really a question of the institutions of that country, the proper authorities of that country to process the elections as per the laws of that nation, but also according to international principles. And the role for international observers is to look at that process and then to comment to the extent to which it was in line, not in line, or could be in better line with those principles that have been established, but not to countermand, not to interfere, not to try to replace those institutions in the places where we observe. And that's true any country that we observe throughout the world.
And finally, often international stakeholders such as the Observer Mission and many other partners and stakeholders often observe, analyze Kenya and many countries' ability to hold a free and fair election. They have their reservations where needed and recommendations on improvements. 21 days to Kenya's 9th of August polls. Perhaps to finalize on this discussion, what are the initial response that you are getting?
I think there is a very keen eagerness for these elections. Voters are very interested. The campaign is very robust, taking place at 6 different levels. There are many different contests, and of course with the devolution to the county level, there's an important focus on the governors, there's an important focus on the local authorities. And so I think really it is an election which is of interest as far as we see to Kenyan voters. And thereby it's also of interest to the international community to see the extent to which those principles that I mentioned before, principles of equality, principles of universality, principles of transparency, principles of accountability and secrecy are part of this process, so that each citizen, each voter feels that their particular choice is reflected accurately in that election process and then translates to a government and to policy making which reflects their positions.
All right, Dr. Bieta Martin, thank you for your time tonight on TV47.
Thank you.
We hope to host you more, given that you are the Deputy Chief Observer of the European Union Elections Observation Mission in Kenya.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure, and thank you for hosting me tonight.
Thank you for your time. You're watching this discussion that we are making sense of Kenya's consequential 9th of August polls. So let's continue with the news a bit. And Gano Party presidential candidate David Mwaure Wahiga has written to the Interior CS, Inspector of Police and other security stakeholders to increase his security after indicating that his security is at risk. In a letter dated July 15th, the party claimed 2 persons turned up at the secretariat of their presidential candidate to see Mwaure, but refusing to be cleared and state their intention. Mike Kagwongo has the details.
21 days to general election and presidential candidate security has been put on the spotlight. after threats encountered at a Agano Party's secretariat. In a letter signed by the party's acting SG Josiah Nyemu, the party claims that two persons turned up at the secretariat of the presidential candidate to see David Mwaure, stating that they were from Garissa and wanted to be his agents in the county. According to the letter, the two said they were referred by Mr. Muhammad and were not ready to give more details after being asked how they knew Mwaure. Nyamu also went ahead to attach copies of their IDs, which they submitted at the party's offices. He added that on further scrutiny, the two individuals were heard making a suspicious phone call, and I quote, "On being discreetly followed by our candidate's county security, they were spotted and heard frantically talking to someone on the phone and saying that they were not allowed to see Mr. Mwaure Wahiga." End of quote. The incident has forced the party to demand more security for its candidate. Barely a month ago, Mwaure asked for more security, saying he might be under the watch of allegedly corrupt people that he attacks during his rallies. The Agano Secretariat now demands high level of security on their party leader and his running mate at the offices, secretariat, residential places, and in countrywide tours. The party has also sent the inspector of police a letter informing him of Mwaure's tours. In the letter, Mr. Nyamu also demands that the government caters for their tours and security upkeep costs as it does for other candidates. Mike Kagwongo, TV 47, Nairobi.
You are watching TV 47, the home of untold stories.
Usiyakubalie maumivu ya misuli kukatiza ratiba yako. Kaluma Pain Balm ni dawa ya kusugua iliyotengenezwa kutoka kwa miche maalum ili kutuliza maumivu ya misuli. Kaluma Pain Balm. Maumivu yakizidi, pata ushauri wa daktari.
Authentic, natural, planned. Transforming. Endless benefits. Slaty, purely Kenyan. Buy now on Jumia or Amazon.
Hey!
Kaluma King Herbal Lozenges zinazo nguvu maradufu kutuliza kikohozi, vidonda vya koo na mafua. Kaluma King ni shwari.
Tika mama huyo muharifu kaiba kuku zangu, vifaranga wangu na mayai zote pia kabeba. Haya, tika mama huyo.
Maumivu yakizidi, muone daktari.
You are watching TV 47, the home of untold stories.
Welcome back. Let's get to the world of sports now, and who best to do that than our very own Dennis Otieno, who is